If you're doubting, but open to believing, I want to invite you to consider the strongest evidence that we have for the existence of God. Have you ever experienced doubt? Maybe you doubted something that you value or something you believe in. Maybe what you doubted was your purpose, maybe even your faith. Doubt. It's that feeling of uncertainty that rises up in us when we just don't have the answers or don't know for sure. The truth is, we all have experiences of doubt. I remember one experience of doubt that if I had listened to it, would have probably changed the direction of my life in significant ways. It was early December 2017 when I was in seminary in Washington, D.C. And at the time, I'd been dating Jenny for 10 months. Now, Jenny rocked pink hair, and I had what was maybe an attempt at a hipster beard. And that day, I told Jen that we were going to go meet some friends at the Jefferson Memorial. But what I didn't tell her was that day, I was planning to propose. My plan was for us to be walking along the water where I had a photographer friend of mine posing as a tourist nearby, and she was going to capture the event for us. And on top of that, I had organized all of our DC friends, including Jenny's family and her parents, to be waiting in the Jefferson Memorial. They were up there so that they could watch as I popped the question, and all of this was without Jenny knowing a thing. Then once she said yes, they were supposed to shout, "Surprise!" and run down, and then we'd all go to a restaurant to celebrate. I had this grand gesture planned down to the minute. But there's one detail I couldn't control. Jenny saying yes. And so I told everyone in the memorial not to run out or to shout surprise until I gave the signal, just in case. So on that December day, as we were nearing the Jefferson Memorial, I have to admit, I became incredibly nervous. My hands were shaking, my mouth was dry. And the reason was because I was about 92% sure that getting married was the right thing to do. But there was also about 8% of me that wondered what on earth I was doing. What if she said no? What if she said yes, but then it didn't work out? But I pulled the ring out of my pocket and I got down on one knee anyway. And the truth is, I had to overcome my doubt, my feelings of uncertainty, just to ask the question, though I'm sure it was nothing compared to the doubt that Jenny had to overcome to say yes. So here's the truth about our feelings of doubt. In any important decision, certainty is virtually impossible. An element of faith is always required. And so it is with all important decisions in life, including matters of religion. Recently, our church went through a series called Wrestling with Doubt, Finding Faith, based on a book by the same name by Adam Hamilton, a Methodist pastor and author. And I want to share with you what is probably the most frequent question that people ask when wrestling with doubt, which is this: is there a God? This question, it comes from a study of 3,000 adults here in the Kansas City area. It was conducted by Church of the Resurrection. And the study reveals 6 main questions or doubts that people have, with this question ranked as number 1. Now, before we look at this question, I want to share one important point, something that's true for believers and non-believers, Christians and atheists alike, which is that as human beings, we want certainty, but God gives us mystery. Before I asked Jenny to marry me, I really wanted some proof, some evidence that this was the right decision. Now, I'd met Jenny on a mission trip. We shared similar visions for life. We enjoyed one another's company and had fallen in love. But even with all of that, an element of faith was still required. And what that means is the fact that God gives us mystery just means that feelings and experiences of doubt is part of the journey. What's interesting is if you look at the Bible, what you find is not a history of people who all have perfect faith. What you find is a history of people who wrestle with doubt. Just a few examples. At the burning bush, Moses, he doubted God and doubted his ability to lead God's people, saying, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh?" After years of fleeing Saul, it was David who began to doubt that he would ever become king of Israel. He said, "How long, O Lord?" After news of the resurrection, it was the Apostle Thomas who refused to believe. He said, "Unless I see, I will not believe." It was in the middle of a miracle. Peter took his eyes off Jesus while walking on water, and it caused him to sink. In almost every story, chapter, character of the Bible, doubt's not just part of the journey. Doubt is the journey. It was René Descartes, a renowned French mathematician and pioneer of the scientific method, who faced criticism for his devout Christian faith, and he had a very unique perspective on doubt. He said this: "If you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life, you doubt everything." In other words, doubt is necessary to find out what's true. It's not just part of the scientific process, it's a part of the spiritual process. And so even though doubt, it can cause us to struggle, even to lose our faith, at the same time, doubt can serve another purpose. Doubt can serve as the catalyst for a deeper faith. Doubt can make us ask important questions. It can lead us to wrestle with God. The reason the Bible is ultimately a book of faith is because it bears witness to what happens when people don't give up on their faith, even in the face of doubt. For example, in the story of Moses, he doubted, but he went to Egypt and he led the people out. King David doubted, but still became the anointed king of Israel. Thomas doubted, but he touched the hands and feet of Jesus and believed. Peter doubted, but was lifted from the waters. The message of Scripture says that we will experience doubt, but that doesn't mean it can't lead us into a greater faith. As was the experience of Ross Douthat. Growing up in a Christian setting, Ross, he was often uncomfortable with the certainties about God and religion that other people held around him. And as a result, he left Christianity for many years of his life and explored other perspectives. But his doubts also led him on a journey of discovery. And after years and years of asking important questions about God, it led him not only to return to Christianity, but to become an advocate for religion in some of America's least religious environments. Today, he's a New York Times contributing writer and the author of a new book titled Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Now, what makes him unique is that while many Christian apologists try to argue against scientific claims, Ross is different because he actually embraces all of them. Because, as he argues in his book, recent scientific discoveries actually strengthens the case for religious belief rather than weakens it. And in his book, this is especially true regarding the question of God's existence. In the book, he makes the case for what he calls the fashioned universe. The fashioned universe, it's the idea that the universe has been fashioned or finely tuned in such a way to make intelligent life possible, to make human beings possible. So some fashioned universe examples are things like this. If at the beginning of time there was a slightly different way molecules behaved, no life on Earth. If even one thing was different about the periodic table, no life on Earth. If even one detail about our solar system was different, such as the Earth's distance from the sun, no life on Earth. He points out that even renowned physicist and atheist Stephen Hawking acknowledges the improbability of life on Earth. As Hawking wrote in his book, "It seems that our universe is held together by a set of seemingly excruciatingly carefully chosen values that, were they arranged infinitesimally differently, would give rise to universes that, although they might be very beautiful, would contain no one able to wonder at that beauty." In other words, the fact that we are here is due to a string of 1 trillion miracles in the design of our universe. And that all happening on accident is improbable. For example, it's like if you were walking in the woods and you discovered a watch laying on the ground. You wouldn't look at it and then assume that its existence was an accident. No, you would think rather that there was a watchmaker, an intelligent mind who had designed it down to the smallest detail. To Ross, this allows him to embrace scientific claims, even the ones that many argue negate the need for a God altogether. For example, Darwin's theory of evolution. Regarding the process of evolution, Ross writes this: the underlying process itself was set in motion. The automated watch factory started its work only because of essential preconditions that is less likely than winning the biggest Powerball in history. In other words, a natural process may appear random, but that doesn't mean it's an accident. Even evolution assumes countless preconditions of a fashioned universe. And the theory of evolution only increases the improbability for humanity to exist. Adam Hamilton in his book draws a similar conclusion, and he brings it back to doubt and faith. He writes this: is it possible that this vast universe and the laws that govern it spontaneously generated without a programmer, a guiding hand, a source, a sustainer? Perhaps. But to me, this proposal that cannot be proved requires more faith in the idea that there is an intelligence, a power, a programmer, a God behind it all. He's saying that after you take in the facts about the miracle that is our universe, you can believe that everything's an accident, but that takes a lot of faith. And so regardless of our views on science and how we reconcile that with Scripture, there is no doubt a reasonable person can believe in God. In fact, if you exclude the United States and you look around the world, there's a higher rate of religious belief among scientists when compared to the general public. It indicates that this idea that to believe in science you can't believe in God might be more of a cultural reality in the United States than a scientific one. Now, I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert, but I think that anyone can stumble upon the truth of this, as in the case of Pete Holmes. Pete Holmes is an American comedian with a TV show and several comedy specials, but what's different about him is that he started out as a youth pastor. And in a world where many comedians use God or religion or religious people as the butt of the joke, he responds to this by pointing out the religiosity of the other side. And in a quote from his last comedy special, he said this:
some people think God created the universe. Some people think nothing created the universe, which is the funniest guess. And the nothing people make fun of the God people. They say God doesn't exist. I'm like, okay, maybe. But you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. That's the defining characteristic of nothing, is that it doesn't exist. So what are we talking about? Either you think it's God, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove, or you think it's nothing, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove. But I think we can all agree, if your nothing sometimes spontaneously erupts into everything, that's a pretty magical nothing, you guys.
As human beings, we want certainty, but God gives us mystery. Science doesn't prove God's existence, but it also doesn't disprove God's existence. Now, you've just heard one argument for God's existence. There are countless more, but whatever you choose to believe, here's the truth. It's going to take faith. In other words, belief in God is a choice that you make. You assess the evidence and make a decision. And you don't make it when you no longer have any doubts. It's a choice that you make despite your doubts. And so, if you're doubting, but open to believing, I want to invite you to consider the strongest evidence that we have for the existence of God. This incredible mystery, this mystery that's all around us. This is actually what we see throughout the Bible, a major theme. We see it in places like Psalm 19 that says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." Here's what science and scripture agree on. We're surrounded by 1 trillion miracles. And if we actually stop to appreciate them, we find that they declare, proclaim, reveal the truth. That there must be a mind, a designer, a creator, a programmer, a God behind it all. I chose to believe in God when I was 17 years old. I grew up in a religious home, and, we went to church every Sunday and that kind of thing. I was the son of a pastor as well. But in truth, nothing about faith or God really appealed to me or made much sense to me. And my church involvement was really more because of family as opposed to a result of a personal faith that I had. But my high school years, things kind of began to change, and I began to feel very lost. And I remember a period of time where I was just consumed with shallow things. All I wanted to do was party and chase girls and smoke pot with my buddies. But I finally got to this point where I looked at my life and I started to wonder if there was more. It was kind of this alone feeling in my life where I had no idea what to do or where to turn. But one night before my senior year of high school, I had this sudden feeling inside of me that I was not alone. In fact, I kind of felt this tug on me to go over to my bookshelf and pull out my Bible. I opened it and I started to read the Gospel of John. And when I got to John chapter 13, verse 34, I read that Jesus said, "I give you a new command, to love one another. And that's how the world will know you are my disciple." And in that moment, as I read that, I had this sudden, powerful feeling that God was speaking to me. And in this command, God was telling me that I was not an accident, but rather I was here for a purpose and on purpose. And after this, I chose to not only believe in God, but to believe God, that I was here on purpose. And so I asked Jesus to follow him and to be his disciple. Now, I can't prove that God changed me, but I can point to the proof of what changed in me. That what I desired before this experience was not what I desired after this experience. That what I valued before was not what I valued after. That the way I behaved and treated other people was not the same after. And the way I thought about the world was not the same. And so in the times that I begin to waver in my faith, to feel uncertain, I feel that, or I experience that doubt rise up in me. I go back to that night, into the holy mystery that I encountered, and I remember that even though I can't fully explain it, something changed. And so I choose to renew my faith. And so if you're wrestling with doubt, I want to invite you to be open to the evidence, which is the mystery that's all around you, which is the miracle that is you. That God has fashioned this universe for the miracle of your existence, and that you are not an accident.